Millionaire stunned to find four identical children on the street, and what he learns next. Have you ever seen something so astonishing it changed your life forever? This is the story of Alexander Harrington, a self-made millionaire with boundless fortune. One fateful night, while on a routine business trip, Alexander stumbles upon an impossible sight: four identical children on a dimly lit street corner. A simple act of compassion unravels into a mystery of secrets, revelations, and life-altering lessons. Prepare for heartbreak and triumph, desperation and hope, as Alexander learns how destiny can overturn even the best laid plans. Don't miss this truly astonishing tale. Get ready, everything changes in a single night. Alexander Harrington was not born into money. His upbringing was modest, tucked away in a quiet suburb outside Chicago. He had parents who tried their best to give him every opportunity, though they struggled with mounting bills and occasional misfortune. Even from a young age, Alexander was different. While other children idolized sports figures or comic book heroes, he immersed himself in biographies of great business leaders and conversations about technology. His father, a construction worker, often joked that Alexander's head was stuck in the clouds, but he was proud that his son aimed to make a name for himself. By the time Alexander reached high school, he was already developing small business ideas, selling customized video game controllers to classmates for extra pocket money. He wanted to do more than just earn a living. He was determined to build an empire. His mother, a nurse at the local hospital, worried that he pushed himself too hard, but Alexander always believed the greatest wealth was born from relentless pursuit. Everyone in that little suburb had their eye on him, believing they had a front row seat to the making of a legend. In college, Alexander's entrepreneurial spirit truly soared. He attended Northwestern University on a partial scholarship, majoring in business administration. There, he rubbed shoulders with bright minds from around the world, and he formed a small circle of like-minded friends who dreamed of launching startups and forging their own paths. By the time Alexander was a junior, he had founded his first official venture, a software development firm specializing in cloud-based solutions for small businesses. The early 2000s were ripe for technological innovation, and Alexander's timing and ambition aligned perfectly with market demands. People on campus spoke of his meetings with visiting entrepreneurs, figures like Bill Gates, who once delivered a guest lecture and later chatted briefly with Alexander about the future of cloud computing. While it was only a short conversation, the impression it left on Alexander was monumental, igniting a fire in him to reach the pinnacle of success. By graduation, Alexander's fledgling startup had earned enough to pay off his student loans, and his reputation as a future business mogul was well established. Yet success seldom comes without sacrifice. In building his company, Alexander lost many things: time with friends, relationships, and the freedom to simply enjoy life. He worked long hours, perfected his pitches to prospective investors, and read voraciously on financial strategy, taking cues from Warren Buffett's philosophies on value investing. Invitations to social gatherings became rarities in his life. Despite the money pouring in and the accolades that surrounded him, Alexander often found himself alone in his high-rise office well past midnight. Colleagues came to see him as driven. Some whispered that he was ruthless. He would do anything to see his company thrive, and if that meant sacrificing personal connections or quiet evenings at home, so be it. While some quietly disapproved of his single-mindedness, Alexander wore his sacrifices like badges of honor. He believed that real fortune could only be won by those who gave everything they had. Unfortunately, in giving everything, he also risked losing parts of himself he never knew he needed. It was a crisp autumn evening in New York City, a decade after Alexander had moved his headquarters to Manhattan for better opportunities. At 35, he was now hailed as one of the brightest minds in tech, with a net worth well into the hundreds of millions. On that particular evening, he was supposed to attend a gala at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, an event hosted by a close associate who had recently become a philanthropic celebrity. But Alexander felt uneasy, a sense of foreboding gnawing at him since morning. Instead of preparing for the black tie affair, he found himself distracted with an urgent conference call that stretched late into the night. By the time he ended the call, the gala was halfway over. He decided to skip it entirely. Leaving his office, he ducked into a sleek black sedan waiting at the curb and instructed his driver, Hector, to just drive around the city. Alexander needed to decompress, to sort out the swirl of thoughts and obligations in his head without the noise of a formal event. The night was darker than usual, clouds gathering overhead and blotting out most of the moonlight. Rain began to patter against the car windows as they moved through quieter streets away from Times Square's bright neon. The city felt somber, the sidewalks mostly deserted, save for a few late-night wanderers. Alexander stared at his phone, scanning through emails he had flagged for urgency, when suddenly Hector braked hard. Peering up from the screen, Alexander saw 4 small shapes huddled under a broken street lamp. At first, he assumed they were just a group of kids out too late, perhaps waiting for a bus or heading home from an evening program. But something about their posture struck him a mixture of stillness and desperation, as though they had nowhere to go and no hope to cling to. Despite the gloom, he could see they appeared identical, 4 little boys or girls he couldn't quite tell, wearing the same oversized hoodies, standing in a row like forlorn statues. Compassion was not Alexander's strongest suit. After all, his life thus far revolved around business metrics, performance goals, and bottom lines. Acts of charity were typically tax-deductible strategies or brand-building exercises. Yet, as he stared at those 4 identical children, something in him shifted. He remembered nights from his own childhood when his parents struggled to pay the heating bill and the house would grow too cold for comfort. In that fleeting moment, seeing these children out in the chilly rain, he felt a swell of empathy. He had long buried beneath ambition. Without overthinking it, he instructed Hector to pull over and rolled down the window. Rain splashed onto the leather seats as Alexander looked out. "Hey," he called softly, trying not to startle them. "Are you kids all right? Do you need help?" The children turned simultaneously, their faces illuminated by the car's interior lights, revealing that they were indeed 4 identical boys, each wearing a terrified expression. What Alexander saw next shook him deeply. All 4 faces looked hauntingly similar, like reflections in a multi-paneled mirror. Their cheeks were sunken, eyes hollow from what seemed like days, without proper rest or nutrition. A sense of protectiveness he never knew he possessed overwhelmed him. He stepped out into the rain, disregarding the pricey suit and custom Italian shoes soaking through. Slowly, he approached them with both hands raised to show he meant no harm. "Where are your parents?" he asked, his voice echoing strangely in the empty street. A single tear rolled down the cheek of one boy, but none of them answered. They only clutched each other tighter, as if they were all each other had. After a moment, the boy who seemed the boldest among them finally spoke. "We don't have anywhere to go. Our mum she's gone." He paused, swallowing hard. "We've been on the streets for 2 days." Alexander felt his heart tighten. He looked around for any adult who might claim responsibility, but the street was empty. Alexander made a split-second decision that would alter the trajectory of his life. "Come on," he said, motioning toward the car. "I can't leave you out here." He expected hesitation, questions, maybe even refusal, but desperation won out, and one by one the children followed him to the sedan. Hector seemed surprised, but said nothing. He simply opened the passenger door, then helped the boys settle into the back seat, providing them with towels he kept for emergencies. Alexander climbed in last, water streaming from his drenched hair down his collar. The car's luxurious interior felt oddly out of place with the ragged boys huddled inside, their wide eyes scanning the plush seats and touchscreen controls. Alexander instructed Hector to drive to the nearest 24-hour clinic. He was no medical professional, but it was evident the children needed immediate attention, if not for physical injuries, then at least for dehydration or exposure. And while he typically carried himself with a certain aloofness, at that moment he found himself more concerned about their well-being than the stock market fluctuations or product launches that had once dominated his every thought. At the clinic, the staff was understandably alarmed to see 4 identical children, grim, silent, and barely able to stand from exhaustion, accompanied by a drenched millionaire in a ruined suit. Alexander quickly explained he had found them on the street. While the nurses took the children to be examined, Alexander sat in the waiting area, uncharacteristically anxious. He couldn't focus on any of the magazines lying around. Even the financial headlines he might typically devour went unnoticed. Thoughts circled in his mind like vultures. Where were the parents? What tragedy had led these children to be abandoned in such a state? He recalled the boy's haunting words, "Our mum is gone." Gone could mean many things: dead, missing, or simply walked away. Part of Alexander wondered if he was stepping into a situation far beyond his capacity. Yet another part of him refused to abandon them. In that short span of time, he felt an inexplicable pull, as though these children had appeared in his life. For a reason, a cosmic sign he could no longer ignore. His phone buzzed with messages from colleagues and investors, but he couldn't bring himself to care. For the first time in forever, his business obligations felt trivial. Several hours passed before a doctor emerged, wearing an expression caught between confusion and concern. According to medical tests, the children were severely malnourished and sleep-deprived, but otherwise stable. There were no signs of physical abuse or major illness, but the emotional toll was clearly heavy. When Alexander asked for the next steps, the doctor explained that Child Protective Services would be contacted. Legally, the state would take custody unless a guardian or relative stepped forward. The children, it seemed, had no documents on them, no identification, no birth certificates. They claimed their mother died suddenly, the doctor said, speaking quietly so the children wouldn't hear. Apparently, there was no father in the picture. They have no extended family they're aware of. The doctor studied Alexander a moment. "I'm not sure how far you want to go with this, Mr. Harrington, but if you hadn't found them tonight, they might have ended up far worse off." Alexander hesitated, a storm of conflicting emotions inside him. He wasn't a parent. His lifestyle was the antithesis of family life. But the image of those 4 identical faces flickered in his mind like a warning he couldn't ignore. Over the next day, official procedures kicked into motion. CPS representatives arrived, asking Alexander countless questions about how he'd found the children, if he knew anything about their background, and so on. The children themselves were too shaken to provide coherent details about extended relatives or addresses. They knew only that they'd lived in a cramped apartment with their mother, who had fallen ill, leaving them with no means to pay rent or buy food. Eventually, they were evicted, drifting from shelter to shelter until their mother collapsed one morning. Unable to contact anyone, they ended up with her body in a municipal hospital, but soon after, she was declared deceased. With no next of kin, the boys had simply walked away, not fully understanding the system meant to care for orphans. Alexander felt a swirl of anger, sadness, and bewilderment. How could society fail 4 innocent lives so completely? After a restless night, he decided to take a temporary step that was entirely out of character. He volunteered to become their emergency foster guardian, at least until more permanent arrangements could be made. This decision was met with shock from nearly everyone in his orbit. His personal attorney, Marcus Hill, called him immediately. "Alex, are you sure you want to do this? This is a huge responsibility. You know nothing about raising kids, let alone 4 at once." His assistant, Isabella, gently reminded him of his jam-packed schedule for the next 6 months: global conferences, product rollouts, investor relations events. "You barely have time to sleep, Mr. Harrington," she noted. But something inside Alexander refused to back down. Maybe it was guilt for all the nights he'd turned a blind eye to the city's homeless population. Maybe it was the memory of his own childhood struggles, or perhaps, for the first time, he felt the stirrings of a paternal instinct, an urge to protect these 4 vulnerable souls. He told Marcus and Isabella he'd figure it out. Money was no issue. He could hire the best nannies, the finest tutors, anything they needed. He insisted that his mansion on the Upper West Side had more than enough space. What he didn't tell them was that, behind the logic, he felt a deeper calling, as though he and these children were irrevocably connected by fate. The following days were a whirlwind of adjustments. 4 new beds had to be set up in the mansion, each in a guest bedroom that had rarely been used except to house visiting executives or extended family. The children whose names Alexander now knew were Ethan, Evan, Eric, and Elliot were understandably overwhelmed by the sudden shift. One minute they were homeless, scrambling for scraps of food, and the next they lived in a grand estate with crystal chandeliers and a panoramic view of Central Park. The staff, including a newly hired live-in nanny named Marion, scrambled to accommodate the quadruplets' needs. Shopping trips for clothes and groceries multiplied. Medical and therapy appointments cluttered Alexander's schedule. Yet, in the midst of this chaos, Alexander felt a strange sense of fulfillment. Watching the boys experience things like a warm bath, clean pajamas, and a soft bed for the first time in weeks lit up corners of his heart he hadn't realized were dark. He discovered an odd delight in being present, to reassure them when nightmares woke them in the middle of the night, or in handing them each a glass of warm milk and a cookie before bedtime. Although he still had no idea how to be a father, he found himself wanting to learn. Of course, not everything was a fairy tale. The children were traumatized, and it showed in their behavior. They hoarded food, hiding bags of chips and fruit under their pillows, as though they might be banished back onto the streets at any moment. They flinched when Alexander or Marion raised a hand to offer something, perhaps expecting a blow. They rarely spoke to outsiders, and even among themselves, their conversations were whispers. As though volume might get them into trouble, Alexander felt unprepared for their emotional needs. He hired a child psychologist, Dr. Vanessa Caldwell, to make regular visits. Dr. Caldwell explained to Alexander that trust had to be built slowly. Consistency and kindness, day after day, would be key to healing their wounds. For a man who thrived on swift decisions and immediate results, the notion of patience was foreign. But he tried. Each day he carved out time to speak with them individually, asking about their favorite colors, hobbies, anything to coax them out of their shells. Bit by bit, they began to open up. A soft thank you here, a shy smile there. It was progress, albeit slow. Meanwhile, the business world kept turning, and Alexander's absence from key meetings and events did not go unnoticed. His board of directors grew concerned. Rivals began to spread rumors that he was losing his edge or perhaps unraveling under the stress of success. A few reporters caught wind of the quadruplets living in his mansion, leading to a flurry of speculative headlines: tech millionaire turns daddy overnight, and billionaire guardian angel or PR stunt. The speculation angered Alexander, though part of him couldn't deny that he once might have leveraged such a situation for good publicity. This time, however, his motives were genuine. He refused interviews, letting his public relations team do the damage control. In truth, he didn't care what the press thought. His primary concern had become the welfare of 4 little boys who were slowly, painstakingly becoming part of his life. His old identity, ruthless entrepreneur, collided with a new, uncertain role as a guardian, a caretaker. It was disorienting, but it also felt oddly right. One afternoon, just as Alexander was about to review some critical reports from his coup, he heard a loud crash from the second-floor hallway. Rushing upstairs, he found Eric sprawled on the floor, tears streaming down his cheeks. He had tripped while racing his brothers. The others stood around him, frightened. In the past, Alexander might have delegated such incidents to a household employee or simply called the nanny. But without hesitation, he scooped Eric into his arms, noticing a sprained ankle and a small cut on his knee. He took him to the in-house medical kit, gently cleaned the wound and bandaged it. The entire time, Eric clung to Alexander's shirt, as though letting go would cast him back into a world of neglect. That moment, so simple yet so profound, stirred something in Alexander. He realized that in caring for this child's small injury, he was shouldering a kind of responsibility he never had before. Instead of feeling burdened, he felt protective, almost proud. He was no longer just a bystander throwing money at a problem. He was part of their lives in an intimate, hands-on way. Not long after, a stranger entered the scene, bringing questions and complications. A private investigator named Maurice Dupont paid an unannounced visit to Alexander's office, claiming he had information about the quadruplets' lineage. Suspicious, Alexander had Marcus Hill present during the meeting. According to Dupont, the children might be connected to a distant relative with a sizable estate in upstate New York. Dupont refused to disclose his client's name without a hefty fee, but he hinted that if Alexander cooperated, the client might offer a financial settlement for the children. The suggestion made Alexander's blood boil. The children were not commodities to be bargained for. Yet he was intrigued by the possibility that their family lineage was more complicated than a single mother who died in obscurity. Marcus urged caution, telling Alexander not to jump to conclusions or to get fleeced by opportunists. Still, the news gnawed at Alexander. If these boys had legitimate relatives, potentially wealthy ones, why had nobody come forward to claim them? The entire scenario felt off, like a puzzle missing a critical piece. Events took another unexpected turn when Dr. Caldwell, during one of her sessions, pulled Alexander aside. She had noticed that all 4 boys demonstrated a startling aptitude for problem-solving games and puzzles. Despite their traumatic experiences, they were bright, extremely bright. Caldwell suggested that they might benefit from specialized education or programs for gifted children. Alexander decided to observe them more closely, quietly setting up little tests around the mansion like complex jigsaw puzzles or advanced math riddles printed out on colorful worksheets. To his surprise, they solved each challenge swiftly and collaboratively, often completing tasks meant for children several years older. Despite their hardships, they possessed a remarkable resilience and cognitive ability. Watching them strategize together, finishing each other's sentences, Alexander was moved. He saw reflections of his younger self in their determination and raw intelligence. A seed of an idea took root in his mind. Perhaps, with the right support and nurturing, these children could excel in ways he never dreamed possible. The question remained, was that future with him, or would someone else step in and take them away? As weeks turned into months, the bond between Alexander and the quadruplets grew stronger, but so did external pressures. The board of his company demanded a clear statement about his future plans. His focus on the children was seen as a distraction from critical business deals. Isabella confided in him that certain shareholders were restless, believing he was neglecting his duties. Additionally, CPS was still involved. Though Alexander had taken emergency custody, the system required a thorough assessment before granting him longer-term guardianship or adoption rights. Social workers visited regularly, checking on the boys, evaluating the environment, and interviewing Alexander's staff. He quickly realized that money alone wouldn't impress these officials. They needed to see emotional investment, stability, and a long-term commitment. In a move that shocked even him, Alexander announced to his senior team that he would temporarily step down from day-to-day leadership, appointing an interim CEO. If they wished, the board could vote to replace him, but he was determined to dedicate himself to the well-being of the quadruplets. The board was stunned, but the unwavering look in Alexander's eyes left no room for debate. For better or worse, he was going to be their father figure. Alexander's decision made waves in the media. Headlines read, "Tech Titan puts fortune on hold for 4 orphans." His PR team scrambled to manage the flood of requests for interviews and appearances. Alexander declined them all, focusing instead on building a stable routine for the quadruplets. Mornings were now filled with a shared breakfast, a novelty for a man who once skipped meals to attend conference calls. He found himself showing the boys how to tie their shoelaces properly, how to pronounce new words they encountered in books. Afternoons included therapy sessions, and sometimes educational outings to museums or science exhibits. Evenings saw them gathered in the mansion's expansive living room, reading stories or playing board games. One night, the boys shyly asked if Alexander would watch a movie with them, an animated film about a family of superheroes. He agreed, surprising even himself when he laughed aloud at the slapstick humor. Later, as he tucked them into bed, he realized he had felt genuine happiness for the first time in years far removed from the fleeting highs of business success. That newfound happiness, however, was tempered by a growing unease about the children's origins. The private investigator's words still lingered in Alexander's mind. One day, he took it upon himself to conduct a more thorough search of public records, obituaries, and genealogical databases. To his surprise, he stumbled upon a mention of a woman named Maribel Carter, who had passed away 3 months prior. She had 4 sons listed in the obituary, born on the same date. The father was not named, but an estranged grandfather was. Further digging revealed that this grandfather, Theodore Carter, had once been a prominent figure in the steel industry, but he disappeared from public life amid a series of lawsuits. If these were indeed the quadruplets' maternal relatives, it meant they potentially had an inheritance. Yet no one from that family had shown any interest, leaving Alexander furious at the neglect. He sought out addresses tied to Theodore Carter, only to find vacant properties and shuttered businesses. The deeper he probed, the more mysteries unraveled. Some suggested Carter fled the country to avoid financial ruin. Others claimed he died under an alias. In any case, no living family member had stepped up to claim Ethan, Evan, Eric, and Elliot. One afternoon, Alexander's phone rang, an unfamiliar number. He picked up to hear the gravelly voice of an older man who introduced himself as Theodore Carter. The call was brief, but unsettling. Theodore demanded to know where his grandsons were, claiming that Alexander had kidnapped them for publicity. Alexander's temper flared. He fired back that Theodore had abandoned these children to the streets, and that he had no right to demand anything. Theodore retorted that the children were his blood, and that if Alexander didn't comply, there would be legal consequences. The call ended abruptly, leaving Alexander furious. But more than anger, he felt fear. What if this man actually had legal standing? Could he drag the children back into a dysfunctional family situation? Alexander resolved to fight, to protect the quadruplets at all costs. Marcus, ever the cautious attorney, advised Alexander to gather all the evidence of neglect, medical reports, testimonies from the hospital, the timeline of the mother's death. If Theodore truly planned to sue for custody, Alexander intended to be ready for battle. Days later, a court summons arrived. Theodore Carter had filed for custody, claiming Alexander was an unfit guardian with no biological ties to the quadruplets. Stung by the accusation, Alexander realized this was likely a power play. Perhaps Theodore believed the boys were entitled to some portion of inheritance, or maybe he simply didn't want the Carter name tarnished by stories of children found on the streets. Regardless, Alexander now found himself thrust into a legal war. For their part, the quadruplets were terrified, having overheard snippets of phone calls and legal discussions. They clung to Alexander, fearing they would be taken away and returned to a life of instability. Each day, Alexander reassured them, "I won't let anyone hurt you, I promise." Though internally, he wrestled with doubts. The court would consider many factors: the best interest of the children, the mother's circumstances, and the paternal side of the family. Money could sway things, but so could influence. Theodore, once a giant in the steel industry, might have deep political connections. Alexander had capital, but he was venturing into uncertain territory. This wasn't a simple business negotiation. Real lives hung in the balance. As the custody hearing approached, Alexander devoted himself to preparing. He spent hours with Marcus, combing through the legal arguments, assembling character witnesses, and organizing documentation of his guardianship. Friends and colleagues who had seen the transformation in Alexander volunteered to testify. Dr. Caldwell prepared a psychological evaluation of the children, stating how they had flourished under Alexander's care. Meanwhile, the media latched onto every development, painting the hearing as a high-stakes clash between two wealthy men, each claiming the moral high ground. But in the quiet corners of the mansion, away from the cameras, the reality was far more human. Alexander was exhausted, juggling the emotional needs of 4 boys who feared losing their newfound security. Each bedtime story was tinged with apprehension, each morning overshadowed by the possibility that soon everything could change. The nights where Alexander once slept soundly, confident in his wealth and power, were now restless. He found himself praying, an act he hadn't done since childhood, for a just outcome that put the children's best interests first. The courtroom was packed on the day of the hearing, reporters buzzing in the hallways. Theodore Carter arrived with a legal team that outnumbered Alexander's. At first glance, Theodore seemed frail, his face lined with age and stress, but his eyes were sharp, and when he locked gazes with Alexander, it was like steel striking flint. The Carter team argued that the quadruplets were indeed Theodore's biological grandsons, and that family should be the first choice for custody. They painted Alexander as an opportunist, a man who had thrived on publicity and might use the children as pawns. Theodore himself spoke in quavering tones about regret and longing to care for his daughter's children. Alexander seethed at the blatant manipulation. When it was his turn, he calmly presented documented evidence of the mother's hardships, the lack of any support from the Carter family, and the dire conditions in which the children had been found. Dr. Caldwell testified about the bond formed between Alexander and the quadruplets, describing how removing them from his home could cause severe emotional distress. The hearing lasted for hours, each side volleying arguments and counter-arguments in a tense battle of credibility. After a brief recess, the judge returned to deliver an interim decision. Family ties, the judge noted, hold weight, but so does the welfare of the children. Given the evidence of neglect and the quadruplets' dramatic improvement under Alexander's care, The judge allowed them to remain with Alexander for the time being, pending a more thorough investigation. Theodore's team bristled, promising to continue the fight. Alexander felt a wave of relief wash over him, though he knew the battle was far from won. Outside the courthouse, reporters clamored for statements. Alexander, with the quadruplets huddled around him, simply said, "I'm doing what's right for these boys." Then, guiding them gently past the sea of cameras, he led them back into the car. Inside, Eric asked, "Does this mean we can stay?" Alexander nodded. "For now," he said, mustering a reassuring smile. "For now." Over the following weeks, a social worker named Rebecca Nguyen was assigned to conduct home visits and interviews, aiming to determine the boys' best interests. She was thorough, interviewing staff members, teachers, and neighbors. Marion, the nanny, extolled Alexander's dedication, speaking of how he had shifted his entire life to accommodate the children. Local librarians recounted how Alexander had brought the boys in for storytelling sessions and learning programs. Dr. Caldwell provided a detailed psychological assessment showing the children's remarkable progress. Even the quadruplets themselves, in their gentle, subdued voices, expressed gratitude toward Alexander, calling him Uncle Alex and talking about their hopes for the future dreams of being engineers, astronauts, or people who help other kids like us. The day Rebecca handed in her report, she offered Alexander a small smile. "I don't have the final say," she said, "but you're doing an incredible job. Just keep being there for them." That evening, Alexander hosted a small celebratory dinner, cooking the boys' favorite pasta dish himself. The man who once brokered multi-million-dollar deals found himself carefully measuring ingredients and stirring sauce, while the quadruplets giggled around the kitchen island. He realized he felt content, truly content, in a way he'd never known before. But life had one more twist in store. Weeks before the final custody ruling, a heart attack claimed Theodore Carter's life. The news arrived early one morning in a curt phone call from Marcus. While Alexander felt no particular sorrow for the man who'd tried to tear the quadruplets away, he did worry about how the boys would process it. They barely knew their grandfather existed, yet he was still blood. Unsure how to approach the subject, Alexander decided on honesty. Gathering the boys, he explained that Theodore had passed away and that there would likely be no further legal challenge. The boys were silent for a long moment. Finally, Evan asked quietly, "Does that mean we're safe?" Alexander nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "Yes. I think you're safe now." One by one, the boys embraced him. The final custody hearing became a formality. With no other claimant and a glowing social worker report, the judge granted Alexander full legal guardianship. Newspapers briefly reported on Theodore Carter's death and the end of the custody battle, but soon the story faded, replaced by newer scandals and clickbait headlines. For Alexander and the quadruplets, it marked the beginning of a chapter they could shape on their own terms. The months that followed were transformative. Alexander fully stepped away from the day-to-day grind of corporate life, entrusting his trusted colleagues to steer the company. Instead, he focused on the children's emotional recovery and educational growth. Each day brought tiny milestones. The first time Ethan spontaneously offered to help set the dinner table, the moment Eric dared to climb a tree in Central Park and grinned as Alexander supported him, the excited chatter of all four boys when they saw the wonders of a technology expo Alexander arranged just for them. Dr. Caldwell began to reduce her sessions, noting the boys were thriving, yet Alexander also arranged for them to give back, instilling a sense of compassion. They volunteered at a local soup kitchen, serving meals to people whose situations mirrored what the boys had once endured. The quadruplets, once traumatized and silent, now displayed empathy and kindness beyond their years, forging connections with other homeless families. In watching them interact, Alexander realized he, too had found a deeper purpose. The relentless pursuit of profit and market share felt trivial compared to the difference he could make in these young lives and, by extension, in the world. One evening, as Alexander tucked each boy into bed, they spontaneously asked for a story about how Alexander had become their guardian. It was the first time they wanted to revisit the night they'd been found. Sitting on the edge of Elliot's bed, Alexander recounted the events: the dark street, the pounding rain, the moment he saw 4 identical silhouettes in the gloom. The boys listened with wide eyes, occasionally glancing at each other as if to confirm they'd all shared the same experience. When Alexander finished, a hush fell over the room. Then Ethan spoke up, his voice trembling with gratitude. "Thank you for stopping that night. Thank you for not leaving us." Tears threatened to spill from Alexander's eyes. He leaned in and said, "Thank you for letting me be part of your lives." In the silence that followed, he felt an overwhelming surge of love and pride. The quadruplets had been his greatest challenge, but also his greatest blessing. He had found a love that not even the most extraordinary business success could replicate. And as they drifted off to sleep, Alexander realized that in saving them, they had also saved him, guiding him from a life of singular ambition to a future filled with family, hope, and purpose. Thank you for witnessing the remarkable journey of Alexander Harrington and the 4 identical brothers who forever changed his life. As he discovered, true wealth isn't measured by bank accounts or stock portfolios, but by compassion, loyalty, and the bonds we forge with those who need us most. If this story touched your heart, please consider showing your support. Click the like button to let us know you enjoyed it. Share this video with friends who might find inspiration in its message. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories like this one. By doing so, you help us continue bringing attention to the resilience of the human spirit and the transformative power of kindness. Join our community and stay tuned for more tales of hope, bravery, and second chances. Your engagement matters. Together, we can spark change, one story at a time.